So I just want to introduce Jeremy. He's the chef co-owner of Larder Restaurant in Cleveland, Ohio.
Restaurant and deli.
And deli, yes. And so he's also the author of, where did I put the book? Oh, there it is.
Co-author. Co-owner and co-author.
Yes.
That's right.
I like how egalitarian you are. Of the book Koji Alchemy, and has actually had TED Talks about this, which is great, and a number of other videos and some really good articles that you've written. And I really admire your kind of ethic and way of thinking about food, about making sure you use like after nose to tail, like using up the stuff after that too. That's really, really amazing. It totally appeals to my kind of Korean heritage, my parents having lived through the occupation and the war, and you just don't waste food, So
you don't even waste the squeal.
Yes. So yeah. So really excited to have Jeremy here with us today, and I think
it's all yours.
Turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here. I remember Cornelia and Sam I did a program about Koji for NAMA, and they were there, and the next couple days I get an email from Cornelia saying, hey, let's talk about this in Georgia too. So thanks for having me here tonight. So Sam, I fell a little bit behind the 8 ball and I didn't get to the slides, but I got some wonderful dried specimens and stuff with me. And I figured what we do tonight, because we got a little bit more time than we do normally for some of these programs, is we'll kind of go a little splitsy. I've got a lot of examples of how we use mushrooms here. And then I figured after that, we can get into the Koji. So, because a lot of things that we do with fungi, and I'm even told by fellow mycophiles, they say, well, oh, I never thought to do that. So we like to have fun with them. In fact, I'm drinking our root beer that we make here, which is made from actual roots. We use sassafras roots in there. We use shagbark hickory bark, oak leaves. But we also use, if I can find where I put it, this one, I don't think you guys get this down south. Got a nice fat chunk of chaga here.
Oh.
And notice obliquus. So, and actually we don't get very much of this in our area here. We're even though from where I am at the restaurant, if I walk 3 blocks north, I'm in Lake Erie. You can't get much farther north in this part of Ohio. But this is from New York State. So we have to go a little bit farther north if we want to be able to get some chaga. But the chaga and reishi are 2 things that we put into our root beer. So we put wintergreen in there and everything except the spices, because we had a little cinnamon and allspice to the root beer. But aside from those, everything that's in there is foraged ingredients. We go out, we collect them, we cook them down in a little bit of maple syrup or birch water, depending on the time of year. And we get this great root beer that we make. So you can drink your mushrooms.
Would you just do a quick little explanation of what chaga is?
Yeah. So chaga is a fungi. It's a conch style fungi, so it's super hard. It from the outside, it looks like wood, and it's got a very craggly and bark-like appearance. It's black. It grows on paper birch, and you can see a little bit of the paper birch bark on here. Chaga is known for accumulating something, I believe, and forgive some of my pronunciations, this butyric acid, which is kind of similar to salicylic acid, which gives us the menthol-y flavor that we find in wintergreen. And chaga produces this as it predates on paper birch. There's many cultures that use chaga medicinally too. It is very high from the verified medical community. It's very high in something called defaction, which is something that we extract from chaga and maitake, and it's actually given to chemo patients as an anti-carcinogenic to help boost their immune systems. So it does have verified medical properties too. So it's a fantastic mushroom. It grows these hard woody knobs that come off the trees, and you can't break them off. You got to go up there with a saw. Yeah, you have to cut it off. It's almost as hard as the wood is. And then inside you have the internal structure of the fungi. It's got there's a little piece here where it broke, and you can see some of the spore network, those white threads in between some of the tissue there. And it's just fantastic. It has this kind of minty, very earthy, mushroomy flavor to it. So it lends itself really well in a lot of steeped applications. People traditionally brew tea out of it, so and drink that medicinally. So it's a fun one, and if you find a lot of chaga, I've seen some people on the internet selling this stuff medical grade for up to $40 an ounce, which is you're starting to not quite, but get into truffle territory. For some of the medical grade stuff. So it's a fantastic mushroom.
You do need to harvest it kind of in a sustainable way, because there are people who go in and just chop it out of the tree.
Right, exactly. So when you're harvesting it, we just take the outer kind of 4 or 5 inches, and the conchs can grow long. I mean, I've seen them 16 inches long, kind of growing out like a cone or sometimes a bulbous mass from the tree. So when we harvest it too, we only take like the outer 5 or 6 inches, and we leave the rest of the mushroom to grow. If you cut it clean at the base of the mushroom, right up at the bark, you're going to kill that, and you're also going to open up a huge wound on the tree. And that's not good for either organism. So, it's infinitely fascinating. Each fungi has its own little rules for, these harvesting guidelines, how you should cut it, how much you should take. And I'm not going to get into the debate versus pulling versus cutting. I think that's been fairly settled at this point, and I do both. But, it's always really, really important to use, these best practices when you're out and you're going out for these things, for the ecosystem and the environment, because there's many other organisms that rely on these besides us, and some solely on them. And then you want to be able to harvest more in the future, and you want others to. So it's always really, really important. That's one of the first things. I get a lot of questions when we do our forages here, because we do group forages out of the restaurant. And, a lot of people ask, well, what are like the basic guidelines for picking mushrooms? I said, well, there are none. Each species is different and specific. And if this is something you're going to get into, you need to learn about the different harvesting techniques for each one. So that's always something that's good to take a look at. So, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I kind of wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on me and what I do here at my restaurant. We're an Eastern European delicatessen and bakery. So we focus a lot on a lot of our heritage for our food is roots in like Jewish deli culture. But our cuisine zone that we kind of focus on is Eastern Europe in through Russia, and a little bit of some of the Asian countries that used to be part of the Russian Federation. So we draw inspiration from all those. And the biggest uniting thing amongst all those cultures are fungi and foraging. So we use them all the time. I grew up in a household, my mother didn't know any mushrooms, but she knew a few wild plants like wood sorrel and purslane, and we had a blackberry thicket down the road. So we would always, she called the wood sorrel lemon clover. So we'd go out in the backyard and we pick some lemon clover and we put in our salad for dinner. And, as I went on, I fell more and more in love with these different organisms and decided that was something that I wanted to do. So I was very, very fortunate. I went to culinary school in the Hudson Valley, And at that time,
30 minutes.
I met somebody named Bill Bacchitis. Bill's really active in the New York State Mycological Society. He's a good friend of Gary Linkoff, who's now deceased. And I was able to kind of work with Bill and shadow Bill and have these great one-on-one sessions with him, going out into the Hudson Valley and foraging. Sorry, I was muted for a sec. Being up in the Hudson Valley and going out with somebody like Bill and every once in a while getting to link up with Gary was just a huge thrill and really imprinted on my culinary style and my taste and the things I enjoy. So, I've been working with these organisms for a long time. Fast forward to 6 years ago, I had my wife and I had our daughter. And me being the mycophile I am, her name is Emilia Morcella Louise. One of her middle names is the Latin name for the morel mushroom, which is quite possibly my favorite. And not too long after that, I actually decided to go get licensed by the state of Michigan as a wild mushroom expert. So, my wife said going back to school to get a degree in mycology, she said the student loans from culinary school were enough. So this was the next best option. And it served us well. So, I kind of want to say too, as we're going, and this is one thing we always discuss, we hold fermentation classes here at the restaurant, and we go out and we do forages and whatnot. And first and foremost, we like everybody to know, like, this is a safe zone. There's no such thing. It's a judgment-free zone. There's no such thing as a stupid question. If you have a question and you think it's stupid, I've probably had it before, and somebody else here probably has it. So it's totally cool to ask. And on that note, this isn't, I don't want you to think of this as school or anything like that. So if you have a question, ask it. Whether you unmute yourself or you put it in the chat. Please just get it out there. It's always good to look at some stuff. So that being said, I kind of wanted to talk about, our work with mushrooms first. And we go through a lot of them here. We're really fortunate. This area of the Great Lakes, in some respects, I honestly feel it rivals the Pacific Northwest in terms of our fungal diversity, and the amount of biomass that our environment generates. I was talking to Sam and Cornelia the other day and told them, we harvested well over 1,000 pounds of maitake for the restaurant this past fall. And that was just from a very small, well-managed location that we forage. There's plenty other places that we didn't even get to this year, just with the pandemic and everything going on. So, we have a lot of fungi here, and it's really, really wonderful to be able to embrace them all. That being said, and as kind of a few of us were discussing beforehand, you guys are getting ready to gear up for morels in like another week or two. We're a solid 6 weeks or so away. That being the case, our fungal season is greatly compressed. We get, we have oysters, and we have, some of the ever bearers, as I'll call them, coming up throughout the year that we go after. But the height of our season is really kind of the middle of June up through, if we're lucky, the first week in November, if we're not covered in snow by then. So every now and then I get lucky around Thanksgiving, and I'm picking some bluets and some oysters that we have fresh for Thanksgiving. And then it's time to basically go to sleep for the winter, and maybe find some oysters every now and then on a warm day. So that being the case, we do a lot of things here to preserve fungi as well as we can. And we do, some of the traditional things. We do, of course, a lot of drying. We blanch and we freeze. So we cook the mushrooms off in some boiling water, and then we pack them away in the freezer. But we do some unorthodox things too, so I'm told. For us, they're completely normal, but we do things like we ferment lots of mushrooms. The same process you would put your cucumbers through to make a dill pickle. We put some of our hardier mushrooms through, like Litiparus and Grifola, so chicken of the woods and hen of the woods. I actually have right here, let's see if you can see that. Here's some maitake, and this is a lacto-fermented maitake. I actually have this. Here's a nice big container of them. You can see they're in a brine, and we do this a lot. And the pickled mushrooms hold up great. Actually, once they ferment to a low pH, so to the proper acidity, we store these at room temperature. So we don't have to clog up the freezer, or the dry storage with all the dried mushrooms. We can keep these in sealed glass jars, not canned glass jars, but lidded glass jars, or we use a lot of vacuum sealing. So we can keep them in these vacuum bags. And literally, this bag that's in this container here that we have in the deli case, I just opened 2 days ago, and has been sitting in my pantry room in the larder at Larder since October-ish. So they hold up really, really well when we do that. And with the pickled mushrooms too, we find them, yes, they do have the kind of the sour notes to them. And these, like I said, these aren't vinegar pickled. These are a lacto ferment. So we actually rely on microscopic bacteria, beneficial bacteria, to actually convert the sugars that are found in the mushrooms into lactic acid, which preserves them. And it's the same technique as, like I said, making a fermented cucumber pickle or a sauerkraut. Same microbes are responsible, and the same end result. So these are sour, but I'll tell you what, they still griddle up great in a cast iron pan, and they get nice and crispy. And if you got some onions in there and put them on toast and melt a piece of cheese on them, the pickled flavor isn't overwhelming, and the mushroom really starts to shine a lot. So just because they are pickled, they're not necessarily a one-note use to, do a shot of vodka and then eat some pickled mushrooms like they do in Russia and Ukraine. So
Jeremy,
yeah.
I had a question about the percentage salt brine, because generally lacto fermentation is done with a salt brine, because
yes,
still are salt tolerant. And there's a few other questions as well that I just want to.
Yeah, most definitely. So
I'm wondering what percent brine you use, salt brine you use.
So we, at your safest minimum level is 2% salt. And what that means is you weigh out your mushrooms, and if you've got any liquid associated with them, anything that's going to be in that container, you weigh it, you calculate 2% of its weight, and that's the amount of salt you add in and make sure you dissolve and mix in good. Here at the restaurant, we kick it up a little bit of a notch, and we do a minimum of 3% salt. We find that also helps with the texture of the pickle. Some things can go mushy over time at 2%. And sometimes when we're sitting on something for 6 months, we want the texture to hold up. And that extra bit of salt kind of acts like an electrolyte. You drink your Gatorade after a hot, steamy forage to replenish, the salt and the liquid into your muscles. And the salt kind of acts in a similar way with these fermented ones. So whenever we do ferments like this too, we always use weight. We don't use volume as a guesstimate. And I know if you look up fermentation and fermented mushrooms and that sort of thing online, you may see some that say, oh yeah, per quart of mushrooms, use a tablespoon of salt or this or that. But we all have a different salt in our pantry.
Right.
Some people have a fine granulated salt. Some people have a kosher salt. And they all have their volume to mass ratios are all different. So we always say weight. And it's really as simple as finding out, using a calculator to find out what that weight of salt is and mixing it in. So one thing to note too, when we do ferment mushrooms, we always cook them first. Just like any other fungi application, right? There's very few mushrooms. It's really some cultivated mushrooms. You see slice Agaricus bisporus on the salad bar, or that sort of thing, which personally drives me crazy too. So I hear all the time, well, why can I eat that one raw but not all these others? I'm like, just cook them all. So we always cook them first. And typically for this application, we blanch them, which means we bring a pot of water to a boil and we dip the mushrooms in there and we let it return to a boil and we let them cook for a couple minutes. And then we take them out and we drain them. When we do ferment mushrooms too, they have enough inherent liquid that you really shouldn't have to add extra water to them. So they kind of create their own brine. Just like when you make sauerkraut, you shred the cabbage, you sprinkle the salt on and you mash it till you extract the liquid out. And these fermented mushrooms, they're great. We love them. And it's really, really nice too, in the middle of winter to have these as an option. So, Cornelia kind of brought up one of our focuses here of using everything. So, after people have eaten all these mushrooms here, then we're left with the brine, this great cooking liquid. So we will use that. We'll cook pasta in it. We'll add it as a little seasoning to broth. We save that salty, tangy mushroom flavored liquid to do all sorts of things. You can marinate things in it. You could whisk a little bit of olive oil and some mustard into it and have a great vinaigrette, and not use any vinegar because you got the lactic acid buildup from the fermentation. So there are lots of really, really wonderful things that you can do with them. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the chat just to see. I see Karen just had a question really quick about birch water. And birch water, think maple sap. You tap a maple tree to get the sap and then cook it down to make the maple syrup. You can do that with birch trees too. So we tend up here to tap the black birch. We find it has the mintiest, kind of smoothest tasting sap. And that's what we use as the base for our root beer. So
we had another question about what kind of pH you're trying to achieve when you're doing the pickling.
Yeah, so when you're lacto fermenting, and my pH meter is put away. I thought I had it handy to show everybody. But I have a little device called a pH meter, which you can find for like 15 to 20 bucks, a decent one, online. And you actually dip it into the liquid and it will tell you what the pH is. And pH is a measure of either acidity or a base or alkalinity. So with most our ferments, we want to be below 4.2 on the pH scale. That's where we start to consider things safe. There's this little gray area up to 5. But for us as a restaurant and dealing with the health department and their rules and regulations, we always shoot for a minimum of 4.2. Some of these will get as hot as 3.7, depending on the available sugars that are in there for the microbes to eat. So, and naturally, without really doing any work, you'll get to that pH.
And I had one other little quick question.
Yeah.
You just mentioned health inspectors. When you first started your restaurant and were doing these kind of out of the jar kind of things, what did you have to deal with the health inspectors?
A lot. And it cost us a lot of money. I mean, we actually had to hire food safety consultants who had to help us draft up these food safety plans. These are called HACCP plans. It's a long and boring thing, but it's very important for not just restaurant food production, but it was designed for industrial food production to make sure foods coming out of factories weren't going to kill millions of people in batch. So we had to design these plans with them, and these plans examine all the steps you take during production and say, oh, during that step, this type of contamination can happen. So you have to be extra careful. And you have to fill out this paperwork log, and it has to have the certified person's initials there that said, oh, we took extra caution. We did everything that the plan says we should do. And that's what we do. So, you know, it also depends on the mushroom friendliness of your state. We got a little bit more pushback here in Ohio. We don't have a licensing program here. And in Ohio, to sell wild mushrooms, they have to come from a licensed processing facility. And this is where my license from the state of Michigan came in play. Because in the state of Michigan, with their Department of Agriculture, in my conversations with them when I got my license, they consider if a food service operator who has a food service permit and also has a wild mushroom license, their food service established can be a licensed processing facility. So I actually had to arrange for someone from the Michigan Department of Agriculture to talk to somebody here locally and explain this. Our department here gave a little bit of pushback, but eventually they were like, okay. And it actually took a few phone calls to our state Department of Health, who kind of pushed back down on the local department and said, listen, they're trying to do this by the book. Work with them a little bit. It can't be so black and white. So
congratulations. Do you find that you get inspected a little more than other restaurants?
Well, no, not per se. So we're classed as the riskiest level of food production. And it's not because of the wild mushrooms, and it's not because we make charcuterie, and it's not because of any of the fermentation we do. It is solely based that when we make soup, we make, several gallons at once and we reheat it. That classified us as the most dangerous type of food establishment because of the cooling and the reheating, and microbes can grow. So because of that, we technically get 4 inspections a year. There are 2 different types of inspections. It's a small technicality. And per state law, though, that passed 2 years ago, they have to bundle those inspections. So we only get 2 visits a year unless there's an issue or, something that has to be traced. And each visit, they do both of the inspections at once. So, every once in a while, there are some reprieves from the burdensome regulations that we have. But, keep in mind, any of these things that we discussed tonight, food safety or proper harvesting techniques or these are all in all of our best interests. And these are things that are designed to protect the most vulnerable parts of any population. So whether it's food safety and it's talking about protecting the elderly or the immunocompromised from, foodborne illness, or we're talking about harvesting guidelines out in the forest to protect the vulnerable fungi that can't run away and hide from us when we go to get them, it's just as important either way. So, it's not the sexiest or most interesting thing in the world to most people, but it is very important nonetheless. So, I do see a question from Jeffrey about pickling affecting a higher level of antimicrobial or probiotic properties. In all honesty, I don't know. I'm sure there's some literature out there. I would imagine that I think one thing you'd have to look into is like something like maitake, which is both considered medicinal and a choice edible. Does the addition of probiotic bacteria, so beneficial bacteria, which is good for us, does it degrade any of the medicinal qualities of the mushroom? That I could see it potentially happening. I could also see it, not happening, and all the medicinal.
Could also make it, more bioavailable.
Exactly.
Actually.
So on a micro and macroscopic level, some of those compounds may degrade, and others may essentially be unlocked.
Go ahead. No, I was curious because you said you blanch the mushrooms, and then normally when we're doing the lacto fermentation, we're relying on the existing bacteria that are on the cabbage or the carrot or whatever. So do you add additional vegetables
or a starter, that sort of thing? We do not, because while, in like other ferments, like, yes, it's in sauerkraut, it's growing on the cabbage leaves, and in kimchi, it's on the cabbage and the chilies and everything. These bacteria are everywhere. Take a deep breath and you're breathing them in.
Especially in larder, right?
Yeah, and even on clean hands, I can wash my hands and then just kind of touch a head of cabbage and go and make these mushrooms, and that's enough of a seed culture to get it going. So even though we go through this cooking step, we've never really had an issue. And before we add the salt and everything, we refrigerate the mushrooms till they're cold. And just the time that it's in the refrigerator, there's enough of these beneficial bacteria in the air to kind of get a little bit of a foothold. And then when we add the salt as a safety measure that wards off the pathogens, the disease-causing ones, we have a perfect environment for the good ones that are there to keep going. So, it's never failed us. I mean, we always end up with really good results. So,
and then you said you vacuum seal them. I'm curious because since there's live probiotic bacteria in them, I know that people have found this out when they've tried to transport kimchi in the airplane in the old days when you could take liquid things, because it'll explode from the air pressure. So it doesn't, that's not a problem with the vacuum sealing it?
So no, essentially it isn't. And our food safety plans here, we've written them to make our fermented foods using vacuum sealed bags. And some of the science on that is still evolving, but most of the published science, and a lot of this is coming out of Denmark and Copenhagen, the university there, has shown that it's actually a bit safer than fermenting in a crock or other vessels. And the reason for it is it's completely sealed off. There's no surface that's exposed to oxygen where, if the little bits float up, they can mold and turn bad. You also don't have evaporation of the brine, that liquid in there, which can happen in just regular crock ferments and that sort of thing. So we find it to be more efficient. The downside to it is we use a lot of plastic. And right now, the plastic that is used, it's a very thick, depending on the type we're using. It's food safe, so it's more expensive because of that. And it's anywhere from 3 to 5 millimeters thick. So it's a very thick plastic that's rugged. It looks like a Ziploc bag, but it's much thicker. So that's the downside. And that plastic is not recyclable at this point. Wow. So, I wish it would be a perfect world, where we could have all the things and everything around us be kept safe. But, there's give and trade. We strike as best a balance as we can with any of this. So, I'm just scrolling through a few more of the comments to see if we have any questions here. And it doesn't really look at.
Yeah, those were the main
questions.
So,
yeah. So I wanted to show you some other things that we do with our mushrooms. And, I talked about using it in a drink, and every once in a while, if I wander away to grab something, I apologize. But this right here, I don't know if you can read the label. I don't know if it's coming up backwards or not.
No, it's great.
Chanterelle mushroom syrup. So who's cleaned their chanterelles before? Scrape the stipe on the outside, get the sand off and stuff. Or even we soak our mushrooms. We have no problem putting them in a sink full of water to get everything off, and then we dry them as quickly as possible. So all the little bits and pieces from the chanterelles that are left over, and there's really no scientific method to this. In a jar, what we'll do is we'll put a layer of the chanterelle trim and then a layer of sugar of equal thickness, and we'll alternate that till it's full, and we'll close it off. And eventually the sugar inverts. It pulls all the moisture out of the chanterelles, or whatever mushroom you have. And black trumpets, this works really, really well with too. Any of those fruitier fungi. And we get this syrup. And then what we do is we blend everything smooth afterwards. And This is great drizzled on vanilla ice cream. It's great in different pastries. My wife is, one of our co-owners here and runs our whole baking program. And, we do a dozen to 20 different pastry every day. So she'll ice a cookie with these. Candy cap cookies iced with chanterelle syrup are really cool. Whenever we do something like that, they sell out immediately. We can never make enough because you can't find food like that, right? But my favorite for this is as a soda. And with the chanterelle syrup, we'll actually add a little bit of vinegar to it if we're going to use it for sodas, just to kind of round out. It needs a little balance. So we add vinegar to taste just till we like it. And we end up, it tastes like a grilled peach soda. It's just got, it's incredible. All that peach aroma that you get from, or apricot aroma that you get from chanterelles, is there. And we mix, I believe, 1 ounce of this to 8 ounces of seltzer, and you've got a great drink. And if you're someone that likes the heavy drinks, add a shot of vodka to that or whatever, and you're going to have yourself a great, great evening. So, the syrups are a lot of fun. We have a soda jerk counter here. We haven't been running it with the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, and once we're out of this, it's definitely something we'll go back to. So I actually still have part of the chalkboard where we have the soda section. We've just got it covered up with a piece of paper. And the last time we were offering fresh sodas, we were offering chanterelle sodas. So it's always something that's a lot of fun. Other things we do too, different types of preserves. So this is our standard recipe. We looked up a recipe for canned and preserved peaches, and we replaced some of the peaches with chanterelle mushrooms. So this is like a jam. It'll be kind of hard to see, but you can see bits of chanterelles in there. So these are, mashed and canned peaches with chanterelle in there. And we have this, to work. This is, and we're going through some of the stuff on the shelves, and, we always miss something here or there, but these are from August of 18. So my wife will be using them this weekend she'll fill a Danish with this and a little bit of cheese.
Is that pressure canned or water bath canned?
This is water bath because there's enough sugar in it.
Sugar, yeah.
Yeah, so
amazing.
Yeah. So speaking of pressure canning, so some mushrooms aren't good dried, and chanterelles are one of them. The flavor is great on the dried chanterelles, but the texture is like chewing rubber bands when you try to rehydrate them and cook them. So to overcome that, we actually a number of years ago, it's probably 6 or 7 years ago, just stumbling around the internet. I want to say it was the Puget Sound Mycological Association out in the Northwest. They had a pressure can recipe for wild mushrooms that they adapted from a USDA canning recipe. So we pressure can our wild mushrooms. The steps we go through to do this is we first cook the mushroom. So the first thing we do is that blanching process where we put them in boiling water, we clean them, we put them in the boiling water, we let the water return to a boil and then cook it for a few minutes depending on the size of the mushroom. After that, we take them out of that liquid. While they're hot, we put them into clean, sterile jars. We add some of the blanching liquid back in here to seal in the mushroom flavor. For pressure canning the quart, I believe we add 1 teaspoon of salt per jar just for flavor and to help preserve the texture. And then any mushroom that we can for 45 minutes in the pressure canner at 15 PSI. So that's the heaviest weight you can put on your pressure canner. And the 45 minutes starts when the weight starts to rock. If you've never pressure canned before, imagine a big pot with a tight fitting lid that's kind of screws on, and it's got a little vent on the top that a weight sits on. And what it does is it allows water to boil under pressure at very high temperatures. In this case, the weight that we use is 15 pounds per square inch. Water is boiling, doesn't start to boil till about 240 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to kill off botulism bacteria. And that's why this is important, because there isn't salt. There's a little bit for flavor, but there isn't enough salt, enough sugar, or enough acid in this food to can it in the water bath method, which is where you boil the jars underwater. So we do the pressure can, and it works great. The texture on these chanterelles is wonderful. And we do this for maitake also. We also do it for some firm and younger boletes. If we're getting nice buttons, we'll do this too. We also like to freeze the boletes too. But yeah, so that's, I see Cornelia, you put that up there. 45 minutes once the rocker starts. And then we let the pressure naturally release. We don't remove the rocking weight or anything. We turn off the heat. We gently slide the pot off the hot surface to the next burner over. And we let it sit there till it naturally depressurizes, which could take an hour or two. Because often we have very big pressure canners. We can fit about a dozen of these jars in at a time. So we love the pressure can jars. The great thing is the liquid that's in here is like the best mushroom stock ever too. So I'll often, when we open a jar, if there's just a little bit of liquid, I'll put in a little container for myself, take it home, heat it up with a little miso, and cook a bowl of ramen. That's my late night dinner. It'll probably be my dinner tonight. So the pressure canning is a great tool. And for those of you that have a small freezer or you don't have a dehydrator, this is a great alternative. The wonderful thing too is a pressure canner, you can get a good pressure canner for around $80 or $90. And if you take care of it, it's something that could last you 5 to 10 years. So it's a minimal investment to be able to invest in preserving mushrooms this way. Plus too, when you walk in someplace and you see like all these awesome jars of canned mushrooms, you have guests over for a dinner party once everybody's vaccinated and happy and safe. You've got some great centerpieces to talk about. So, and this, like I said, for a mushroom like a chanterelle that doesn't dry really well, it's a fantastic option. The good thing is too, a lot of times when you freeze mushrooms, I don't know about you, but when I first started, I would like fill a gallon Ziploc bag of like these frozen mushrooms. And then I'd go to pull them out of the freezer to cook for dinner for like me, my wife, and our daughter. And I'd say, oh my God, there's already like 5 pounds of cooked mushrooms here. And I pulled this out of the freezer. We're going to be eating mushrooms like every meal for the next week. So this is, you can use smaller jars. So it's really nice that you can just kind of grab a little bit of what you need instead of having, this, a huge amount of mushrooms that you have to figure out what to do with. So we do that a lot. Chanterelles and maitake are the two big ones we do with that. But like I said, some nice firm buttons of different boletes work really well. Black velvet boletes, the Tilapia alboter, and then Bangerina bicolorus, the bicolor bolete, the buttons can very, very well. So, and they're great. And once you open this, you can cook this like it was a fresh mushroom. You may want to squeeze a little bit of the liquid out of them gently, but throw these in a buttered skillet and let them get crispy. And they're just absolutely wonderful. That, or stew them in a little bit of cream, and pour that over a pork chop, and you're ready to go. So, speaking of drying mushrooms, we do dry a ton. This here is a mixed bag. These are different boletes, mainly bicolor boletes. I was looking at it earlier, and there's a few Hygrophorus milkies in there. Lacteris hygrophorides is in there that I put in this bag. But So this is a 1 pound bag of dried mushrooms. This would be like 10 pounds of fresh mushrooms. You know, so here's an example of like, oh, there's these great ones. You know, we cut them into nice slices. We dried them so we can reconstitute them and use them. But that isn't the only thing that, you know, the only type of mushroom you should dry. You know, the nice pieces that you want to reconstitute and use. This is a mixed bag of some overgrown latiparus, some chicken of the woods, and some Berkeley's polypore. We will high temp dry these at about 165 degrees. We found out high temp drying creates better flavor in dried mushrooms than low temperature drying. Low temperature drying would be, you know, 120 degrees or lower. The high temp drying, you know, anywhere between 165 degrees and 195 degrees Fahrenheit leads to much better flavor in the mushrooms. But this was the kind of the stem butt part where it's a little firmer and harder. And also some old overgrown ones that weren't horribly bug infested. You know, we use this as mushroom powder for all sorts of things. It's a great seasoning. And when we have a lot of it like this, if we're doing different fried foods and whatnot, we'll replace like up to half the flour mixture that you're dredging or battering something in with dried mushrooms. It works wonderful. You get incredible flavors. These are great blended with salt. And then you got your little salt cellar on your table when you're eating and you want to sprinkle a little salt on, you got a great mushroom flavor to go with. So all those tough and, you know, parts that you wouldn't normally eat, those are the greatest ones to dry and use for so many different applications. Even here, there's a big bag. This is all like the butt end of maitake, of Grifola frondosa. You know, where it was either too hard to clean it really, really well, or, you know, just the firmer parts that weren't gonna eat up, even some of the smaller broken pieces. So, you know, we dry these all up, you know, we use them for stock. This is great too. If anybody likes meatloaf or meatballs, you know, working these, you know, and you can incorporate them dried into your raw meat mixtures and they'll rehydrate beautifully. And then you get great mushroom flavor in there. So whether you grind them to a powder or you just kind of break them up a little bit, they work absolutely wonderful that way. So, you know, drying is a great technique. We use it for plenty. So, you know, other things that we use mushrooms for, we try to incorporate them into all our menus all the time. And here at Larder, one of the things that we decided we wanted to do is a part social experiment, both for how a restaurant operates and also for how diners react, is we change our whole menu daily.
Wow.
So yeah, we're well known for our pastrami sandwich and our fried chicken sandwich. Those are the only two things that we offer every single day. Wow. The whole rest of our menu changes on a daily basis. And we decided that as seasonally as we work with the wild fungi and plants that we forage and the way we work with our farmers, that would give us the best opportunity to be able to use every ingredient to its full potential in season. We actually have a sign up on the menu that says no substitutions, because we often get a lot of people in and they say, oh yeah, can I get a fried chicken sandwich? Can you put onion and tomato and lettuce on there? And, you know, it's the beginning of March. We're just coming out of winter. I have very little access to fresh lettuce. We have a local greenhouse we get a lot from, but I don't have tomato slices to put on your sandwich. You know, so we have this sign up there that lets people know, and also allows us to open up this dialogue to people and say, well, we really prize food when it's fresh and in season. When it's not, we do what we can to preserve it in ways that allow us to enjoy it outside of season. I see Jeffrey's comment, and yes, this is definitely Body by Larder right here. That is a well-known diet plan in town here. I've definitely put on a few since we've opened. But, you know, part of this kind of experiment with operating too is when we have all these different wild ingredients coming in, if you come in at the height of chanterelle season, I have a fresh chanterelle salad that we'll make. We'll cook off the chanterelles. We'll maybe add some herbs to them or some dried fruit or whatever we have on hand. And I can sell you a $3 deli side of literally, you know, like one of these deli paper boats just mounted with chanterelles for $3 because we're foraging them and we're using them in season and we're focusing on the ingredients that are available to us. So we felt too that 2 blocks away from us is one of the largest public housing projects in the city. And we felt that if we could do that and allow access to ingredients that most people think are like exquisite and high end, and you have to spend a certain amount of money to access if you don't know how to forage them yourselves. Like you could come here and be able to have that same dining experience that someone is paying $100 a head for at a fancy restaurant. So, you know, other times during the year, you know, once I get into winter and I start using the chanterelles, we'll charge a little bit more for them and that sort of thing to accommodate for off season. But the joy of working cyclically is that we can do this. You know, another thing that we do too is we never place an order with our farmers. And we work with about 25, 26, both small market gardens and farmers in a 2 or 3 county area here. We simply say to them, we have X amount of dollars to spend with you this week. Bring us whatever you have. And that allows us as chefs, our creativity is never stagnant. Sometimes I get $100 worth of eggplant, $100 of wholesale eggplant. We're not talking retail price at the grocery store. You know, that's a lot of eggplant. So sometimes we have to get very creative with what we do. The great thing is we get a great price on these ingredients. Because oftentimes the farmers, maybe there's an ingredient that isn't moving at the farmer's market or the produce auctions. And they know that we'll, as long as it's in good shape, you know, we'll gladly accept it and allow them to give us what they feel is either needs to be used or is the best of the season. So, so coming back to mushrooms, I've got this here in this little boat. Let's see. Can you see this? A little clear. So this is a pate. And a lot of people they hear the word pate and they get scared right away because they think it's just filled with liver. This pate has no liver in it. This one is about 80% chicken skins, a little bit of chicken. And then it has Chinese fermented black beans, something called duchi that we use the koji to make. And there's a there we go. There's a morel. So right now in our deli case, we have this pate that's made with chicken and morels and fermented beans. We serve it on our meat board. We do a sandwich fairly frequently. We call it the auto banh mi. So it's the Vietnamese banh mi sandwich. Because we're an Eastern European deli, it's got like a German influence, and we call it the auto banh mi. So this was the pate. We always change kind of the ingredients that are on it. We always have some pickled veg and some fresh herbs and a little bit of mayo. But then we also have like a roast or sliced meat. We always have a pate or a rillette, like a whipped meat on there. So we've been serving this chicken skin pate with morels on that sandwich the past few days. You know, even in the middle of winter, we make sure those mushrooms get in there. So they're just a wonderful thing to use. So, yeah, I see somebody say chicken skins and yes, the chicken skins, we pressure cook them. And those we cook at about 10 PSI, for about 35 minutes. And it completely converts all of their collagen into gelatin. And then when we mix it with a little bit of raw chicken and the mushrooms before we cook off the whole thing. But the texture of this on your tongue, because the skins were cooked into a full gelatinous state, it's very silky. It tastes more like a chicken custard, if you can imagine that. like think creme brulee or pudding, but chicken flavored when you bite into it. So it's just wonderful experience and texture too. And then you get a nice bite of morel, and it's absolutely wonderful. So
what were those parameters you said for the chicken skin?
For chicken skin, we do 10 psi in the pressure cooker for 35 minutes.
Okay.
And then what we'll do is we will pull the chicken skins out, get as much of the liquid off of them as possible, and spread them on a sheet tray or a baking tray and let them cool in the refrigerator.
So that was a pressure canner or cooker?
Same thing.
You could do it in a cooker.
A pressure canner is just a really big pressure cooker.
Right, so, with a more accurate gauge for a lot of them. Okay.
Yeah, we use our pressure canner for it because I get 40-pound blocks of chicken skins from one of my Amish farmers. So we do a lot at one time. But if you have just a smaller, like 2-3 quart pressure cooker at your house, you would use the same parameters. So
that is cool. Did you pick that up? Was that your invention?
Yeah, it's something we've been doing for a while. Chicken skins in Eastern European Jewish cuisine, the Yiddish name for them is gribbenis. So when you cook them down to make the schmaltz, the chicken fat, you get all these crispy bits of skin. So we always like to use these, very traditional old world ingredients and kind of put modern sensibilities on them. So I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, let's get into some Koji.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's do it. I saw Cornelia show that beautiful white kimchi, which we try to make a version of that every summer here, and early spring when we're getting the green garlic in and that sort of thing. It's a lot of fun. But my friend, her name is Ying Grasso. She's here in Cleveland. This is called Dao Lu. Dao Lu is the Taiwanese name for a beverage that's kind of like a watered down amazake. So she uses the Taiwanese version of Koji, and she mixes it with water and rice. She grows the mold on the rice. She mixes it with water. She seasons it with a little ginger, and she makes this awesome beverage. And we're hoping in the next couple of years she'll be nationwide with it. But so it's not just us here at Larder and chefs working with this. This is people across the aisle that are working with this Koji ingredient. In fact, there's a major national dog food maker who has been using it in one of their high-end food lines as of recently. So for those of you that don't know, Koji is the Japanese name for the filamentous mold Aspergillus oryzae. A filamentous mold, you've all had experience with them. They are fungi. They are different than the fruiting fungi we're used to going out into the forest to forage and look for. But filamentous fungi you see when you eat a slice of brie or camembert, or you go to the Italian import market and you get a sopressata or a salami and it has the white mold on it. Or you've got a loaf of bread sitting on your counter in that bag, that plastic bag, and you look at it in a few days, after you forgot about it, and it's got black mold growing on it or blue mold. These are all filamentous molds, and their life cycle is really similar to fruiting fungi. They start off as a spore, and right here, I have this jar of Koji spores. Now, this one happens to be white. The two links I posted for sourcing spores, one is for Higuchi Matsunosoken Shoten in Osaka, Japan. It's a little difficult to order from them because they don't have an online store. You actually have to contact Koichi Higuchi, the 8th generation owner of the company. They're about a 250-year-old company. Higuchi's great. Koichi's great. He's a young guy. He's in his late 30s. He's just taking the company over from his father. They produce the Koji spores. They don't have an online store, though. So you got to email Koichi, and you do have to do a currency exchange to be able to source spores from him. But if you're going to get into Koji, he's got probably the world's best selection. The other link I posted is for gemcultures.com, and they're based on the West Coast. They sell much smaller packets of Koji spores. I believe you can get a 40-gram packet of spores, which is like 1.5 ounces of pure spore material, with shipping for about $40. Now, it should be noted that 40 grams of spores is enough to grow a couple 100 pounds of Koji. So a $40 investment can go a long way. So Gem Cultures has a wide list of spores they offer. I guess before we get into why they offer different types of spores, we should talk about why this mold and why it's used. So this is one of the oldest domesticated organisms on the planet. Concrete archaeological evidence puts it back 9,000 years. It's believed rice was domesticated somewhere between 9 and 10,000 years ago. So this was essentially domesticated right around the same time as rice. And a lot of archaeologists and microbiologists believe that Koji could have very well been domesticated 10 to 12,000 years ago. We just don't have the physical, tangible archaeological evidence to say that at this point. So they know that this was domesticated that long ago because a dig in kind of northeastern China, kind of central northeastern China, revealed clay pottery from a site that dated to 9,000 years back. And the clay pottery, when they ran it through a mass spectrometer, this machine that can tell us all the individual molecules that are in something, they found direct, confirmed, and correlated evidence that said that vessel held rice, hawthorn, which is a wild relative of apples, honey, and alcohol. And the only way you can make alcohol out of rice is if you use this Koji mold. And what it does, as the mold grows, it uses a process, and all fungi use this. It's called extracellular digestion, meaning when we eat something and we digest it internally. When fungi eat, they literally grow on their food source, and through their body tissues, they secrete these enzymes. Enzymes are specialized types of proteins that do very specific tasks. And they slather these enzymes and digestive juices all over the food they're growing on. And then those enzymes break their food apart into very small molecules that they can then literally reabsorb through their body lining. And this is all this mycelial mass, right? This network of these hyphae that are growing that do this. And we found out that Koji itself produces, well, we now know it produces hundreds of enzymes of these specialized proteins, but it produces 3 in large concentrations. And one of them is called amylase. Amylase breaks down a starch called amylose, which is the most widely found starch in the plant kingdom. Amylose is made up of lots of little links of small sugars. And the Koji can use its enzymes to break apart that starch into these small, simple sugars. And it uses it to feed itself. But for us, we harness small, simple sugars for the purpose of fermentation, whether it be for alcohol production, which is one of the earliest evidences we have of the use of this organism, or it be for lactic fermentation or other things. All of these beneficial microbes, whether they be yeast for alcohol production or lactobacillus for different types of fermented foods, whether it be yogurt or sauerkraut or kimchi, they rely on these simple sugars. So Koji can create it where it isn't available, essentially. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. It's just bound up in a molecular form that organisms can't take advantage of. So Koji's enzymes break this apart. They also produce another enzyme called a protease enzyme. And this enzyme breaks apart proteins into the smaller things that make them up. And those are called amino acids. The most famous or infamous amino acid oftentimes is glutamic acid. We know it in its refined form as monosodium glutamate, or MSG. So Koji can actually use its enzymes to naturally synthesize MSG out of a food. And when it does that, it makes the food, when we eat these different amino acids, they taste very heavy on our tongues texturally. Sometimes they can be very unctuous feeling, not quite greasy, but something along those lines. Like fatty meat is unctuous and cheese is unctuous. It has this kind of silky, velvety feel, but it tastes very savory. Savory is a word that we use in English to describe it. The Japanese call it umami, if you've heard that word. So these umami foods, Koji can help us produce. And the other enzyme it produces is something called lipase. And who has a washing machine? Uses commercial laundry detergent. And now we have all these HE, high efficiency detergents where you just have to use this much for a huge load of laundry. Well, for about 70 years, roughly at this point, commercial soap manufacturers have been growing Koji for its lipase enzyme because this is a fat degrading enzyme. It breaks apart fats. So you've had it in your laundry detergent for quite a long time, and it's responsible, aside from some of the newer detergents that use oxygenation, right? You've seen the OxyClean and all that, but other detergents use this active enzyme to break apart oil and grease stains on your clothes. Now, when Koji does this in our food, it does something really interesting because fats are made up of something called fatty acids and esters. And fatty acids and esters are responsible for giving our food aroma and making them smell the way they do. So let's take a strawberry, for example. If you were to hold your nose and eat a strawberry, you would register its taste. So it would taste sweet if it was a good strawberry, and sour. That's what you would register. Now, the strawberry flavor, which is made from these aromatic compounds, you wouldn't taste because your nose is closed off. If you opened your nose and chewed the strawberry, then you could say it was strawberry. You wouldn't just taste the sweet and the sour that your taste buds are picking up. You'd actually get the aroma from these volatile esters and fatty acids that are floating in the air as you're eating the food. They're coming off the food and you're mechanically breaking them apart and separating them in your mouth, and they're going up through your nasal cavity, and then voila, you get strawberry. So Koji can create these aromas and these flavors. It's really interesting too. So who has smelled mold before?
Can I raise
Nobody looks too pleased when they say that. But it smells like a wet dog or like something rotting, dank, like a flooded basement or a cave. Koji smells nothing like that. When Koji grows, it's able to break apart if you grow it on rice, for example. And it grows on starchy substrates. The starches are mainly what the mold is after. But it finds microscopic bits of fats and breaks them apart. And most varieties of Koji, when it's growing, people describe the aroma as honeysuckle or green apple. Some people say pineapple or mango or champagne. These definitely aren't the words you would describe the mold growing in your bathroom, God forbid, or the mold on some leftovers in your fridge. They're the exact opposite end of the spectrum. And this is one of the reasons that microbiologists investigating the evolution of Koji and archaeologists feel that people fell in love with this mold. So let's kind of get into some of the practical things and how people harness this mold and what they use it for, right? It's great to talk about, oh, it does all these fancy little things on a microscopic level that I can't see or maybe even understand. But why is it used and why do people find a benefit from it? Who's eaten miso? Who's drank sake? How about who has soy sauce in their house? I should see every single hand up, whether it's a little packet from to go or it's several bottles because you keep forgetting that you have some at home. So none of these foods can be made without the Koji mold. And these are some of the most widely consumed foods throughout all of Asia and Southeast Asia. If we look at where the majority of the world's populations are, more people on this planet now and in the past have enjoyed diets that have featured Koji as a cornerstone, or I should say foods made from Koji, as a cornerstone of their diets than people that haven't. So in the West, we're just starting to kind of catch up to this. And we're just starting to realize, how wonderful this organism is. So let's take something like miso for an example. And whether you call it miso, which is the Japanese name, or jiang, which is the Chinese name, or something like gochujang, which is used in the Koreas. Cornelia, I'm sorry if my pronunciation's off. But any of these fermented bean pastes that we find in all these different cultures, and we even find them in India and the Philippines and Malaysia. We find them all throughout the Indo-Pacific, all over, Thailand, Vietnam, you name it. We find these, and they all have their own names and their own given cultures and languages associated with the people that make them. Miso is been, or as we'll generally say, an amino paste, because they are pastes. Here's a bag of one. See, and it's rich in amino acids, these glutamic acids and others, which are very tasty, and also an indication of nutrient-dense, bioavailable foods. And this one, by the way, is a huitlacoche. So this one's made from Ulstata matus, the corn smut. So I mixed that mushroom. I grew this mold on some black beans. And huitlacoche, and then about 10% salt by weight, and we let it sit for about 6 months. And so we have a miso made out of the huitlacoche. We also have a ton of huitlacoche in the freezer that we always do a mushroom grilled cheese with that people love. So we'll use this to make a spread, a seasoning for that sandwich too. Miso, or these fermented bean pastes, were so important historically, and these are made by this mold. You grow the mold on some beans or some rice. You mix it with salt, enough salt to safely preserve it. In some cases, minimum for some styles of these fermented bean pastes, it's as low as 5% salt. But in some regional varieties, especially in Japan, they go almost as high as supersaturation. With supersaturation of salt is around 20 water. At that point, you can't dissolve any more salt into water. So some of them make these fermented bean pastes that have like 23 to 24 to 25% salt in them. But you mix them together and you let them sit. And you ask yourself, well, why would somebody do this? Why would somebody make their food go moldy? Let's kind of use the Wayback Machine and bring ourselves back to, parts of Asia several thousand years ago. There's no refrigeration. There's very little pest control out in the field. Your storage of grains and beans, your staple foods. Why would people use a mold, which can spoil, most of the ones we're familiar with, spoil our food, to preserve it? Well, they found out that with this extracellular digestion, this process of Koji using its enzymes to break down a substrate, not only were we able to preserve the food because we could break it down into smaller molecules that then beneficial bacteria could come in and help preserve them, but it would be used in creating shelf-stable foods. A lot of times, especially in Japan and in parts of China, they count the age of a fermented bean paste by the amount of summers it's lived through. So they'll say this is a 1 summer miso or a 2 summer miso. And through, back in the Wayback Machine, before we had controlled atmospheres like indoor AC or refrigeration, you relied on the ebb and flow of seasonal temperatures to kind of warmer something is, the more it ferments. And the colder it is, the slower it ferments. So these were made at harvest time and allowed to, that was like kind of their first summer. And just as it was getting cold, they could ferment in a way where they didn't get too overpoweringly sour, like a pickle would get. And they developed more savory flavors because the microbes were subdued, and the residual enzymes, even though the mold is dead in there, its enzymes impregnate continuing to act. And they broke apart these foods into not just delicious tasting foods, but what's really important here, foods with more bioavailable nutrients. When you eat and when you digest, you expend energy. You expend energy to produce your food, to grow it, to then harvest it and forage it, to then prepare it so that it can be eaten, and then finally in digesting it. Well, with these Koji foods, these foods made from Koji, you're letting the mold do a lot of the digesting for you ahead of time. So nutrients that your body would normally have to work pretty hard to free up and get out of your food, if it could even do that, because some of these nutrients are digesting as fast enough that they just pass right through us and they're excreted, whether it's in sweat or urine or feces. The Koji mold could break apart and have readily available so that when that food hits your tongue, starting to absorb some of the nutrients that may not have been broken apart and extracted during digestion at all. So you actually create foods that have greater access to the nutrients that are in them, and thus, at least for our health, they're healthier. There is a flip side to that. There have been some new studies that shown a lot of cultures, we eat too much. So if we eat too many foods that have lots of bioavailable nutrients, we can actually get way more nutrients than we need, especially nowadays with that thing. So nowadays we kind of have to use a balancing act with these. But going back thousands of years, to be able to have a bowl of steamed rice, maybe an egg or two from a chicken, and a fat spoonful of miso, you could really get a lot of the nutrients that your body needed for you to stay at a minimum level of health. Seasonally throw in some fresh greens or some pickled vegetable and that sort of thing. And literally, for very little money, you could have for you and your family that could go much farther than meats or milk or dairy at the time, because we didn't have the technology to preserve them and keep them safe. And they were also really expensive. We're talking at a time when, I don't mean to generalize, but I'm sure most of us were not landowners and didn't have access to killing the animal. Why kill the cow if you can get the milk and make cheese? Why eat the chicken if you can always get some eggs? So you kind of have to train your brain to think about why these foods evolved, what at the time. So, Koji ended up being this just absolutely wonderful, wonderful thing that allowed so many people to really turn some of their focus solely on sustenance and surviving for them and their families. And one can make the argument, start pursuing things like music and art and architecture and medical studies, because you had shelf-stable foods sitting around and you didn't have to think as much about where your next meal was going to be. Really, really important advancement in our emerging technologies and in the development of us as a cultured species. Koji can literally be attributed to helping all of these things happen. And if we look historically too, at some of the advents of other technologies in whether they be warfare or medicine or arts and music, most of the major ones were coming out of Europe and other places. A lot of us, grew up in school and we were like, oh, everything was happening in Europe. They invented this and that. And now we know that, well, no, a few hundred to a few thousand years before, depending where, a lot of this was coming out of Asia, and even some of it, you know, out of Arabia and South America, even for various things. So it's I can't stress enough how important this organism is. So how do you use this organism? How do you grow koji? You can all use this to make things like miso and sake, make your own alcohol, make your own soy sauces, or we call amino sauces. And the first step is to get these koji spores. After that, and I mixed this up earlier, I got a little bit ahead of myself, but I have here some cooked rice, and I cooked it in a way where it wasn't mushy or overcooked, but this could very well beans or any kind of starchy grain. It could be wheat berries. It could be nixtamalized corn, which I see someone brought up. And nixtamalization in corn is important, so we get the endosperm off there, and we can free up the starches in it. But it could be any of these things that have a lot of starch in them. And simply what you do is you cook it, you cool it to body temperature, and then you sprinkle some of the spores on. Anybody grow any type of fruiting fungi? Basement or anything? I'm seeing a couple nods. You know, a lot of people grow oyster mushrooms. I grow almond agaricus in my garden and wine caps and bluets in my yard. So those fungi can take from a spore to a fruit up to many months for that to happen. In some cases, many years for a harvestable colony to be able to establish itself. To being ready to eat and use to make other foods in 36 to 48 hours. So this is a very, very fast growing organism. So after you cook your substrate, you literally shake and sprinkle some of these spores on here. And now this is not pure spore in here. If I had pure spores in here, there's so many of them and they're so small and so light that you would essentially waste a lot of them. So what you do is you disperse them in another medium. It's a 1-to-10 ratio. So that means for every 1 gram of spores, because that's how they're measured because they're so small, 1 gram of spores, we mix it with 10 grams of some sort of flour. You can use rice flour. You could use cornstarch. You could use wheat flour. You know, people pick different starches based on various things, dietary restrictions and whatnot. Flour here. This allows us as a restaurant to have something, all our koji products can be gluten-free throughout. But we mix it with this, and then we take a little bit of this roughly, and in the book, we've got the exact weight measurements. I always forget off the top of my head, but I take about a teaspoon of this mixture, and I can sprinkle a teaspoon of that mixture on conversion here, about 5 pounds of cooked rice. And that's enough of this spore mixture to grow that much koji. So it's a very, very small amount. If you were using pure spores, you would imagine you had a long fingernail, like that much spores, right? You'd have to find a way, if you use pure spores, to evenly sprinkle that on 5 pounds of cooked rice. It's really difficult. So that's why we do this disperse easier. And the added starch from the rice flour, the wheat flour, whatever you're using, is just more food for the mold. So after that, this mold is tropical, right? It comes from a tropical into temperate part of the world. So you need to hold it somewhere that's fairly warm and fairly humid. Between 70 Fahrenheit is ideal. So behind me, I have this commercial dehydrator here that I can hold a lot of things in. I can dry mushrooms and grow koji at the same time. And it holds very specific temperatures for me. But if you're just getting to this at your house, if you know you're not going to be cooking in the oven for a couple, your oven will probably hover around 85 or 90 degrees with the door closed. Or the top of your refrigerator's up against the wall and its compressor and condenser are blowing hot air out the back of the machine and up. So the top of your refrigerator is probably around 80 degrees. So if you can put the grain that you sprinkled the spores on in a container, we keep the layer about an inch to inch and a half thick, and then we wrap it in plastic and we poke a couple holes just in the corners. Be some airflow. This mold needs oxygen, just like us. One of the ways that we are similar to fungi. So a couple holes in there, and then let it sit for about 36 to 48 hours, and you will have koji. So after you have your koji, the world is your oyster. And I'm going to show you some examples of different foods that we make here with koji. And they all kind of, for the most part, fall into like these three main categories. These amino pastes, which are these fermented bean pastes. Some that aren't bean-based. Amino sauces, think soy sauce. And then alcohol, which also includes vinegar. So I've got here, and granted they're vacuum sealed, but, and this one you can hopefully get a good sense of the mycelium there. So these are oats that have not been pressed flat for making oatmeal. This is a brick of koji. The mold has grown on this rice and this oat berries. Here's a, can you see that? There's some of the mycelium. It kind of looks white and fuzzy. And I can use this as the catalyst for all these different fermented foods. Now this is also koji. This is black, which black mold. And koji, while I didn't bring up the name Aspergillus oryzae before, there's a few other species of Aspergillus that are also referred to as koji. And this one, there's a little bit of debate. So originally this was called Aspergillus awamori. Awamori is a type of alcohol that they make in Japan. They make sake, which is brewed like beer, but then they distill it into hard liquor. Mold was traditionally used to make that. We now know this is a variant of a mold called Aspergillus luchensis, and the variant is called awamori. Those are just some technicalities, but this one is black. There's also a brown variant of this. The unique thing about this koji is as it's grown, its metabolic process, it also produces citric acid at very high levels. So who here has drank soda or eaten Sour Patch Kids or a lollipop? About 95% of the world's citric acid production is because of this koji that they grow on industrial scales. And then they're able to leach off the citric, clean it, and then grow it and let it crystallize. And then they have citric acid to use in all sorts of different things. So I do see Joy's question here. Give me one sec just to read through it.
Yeah, someone had asked previously if you could make your own koji, so I think Joy is...
So yeah, before I get to Joy's question here, you know, about contamination with Bacillus cereus and whatnot, we'll address growing your own koji. So yes, you can grow your own koji, but unlike sourdough fermentation, vegetable fermentation where you backslop, you take a little bit of this starter and you use it to make the next batch. You do not do that with molds. This is very different. That's why we buy spores. And the reason for that is, as romantic as we can think about a spore producing company in Japan growing these spores in a 200-year-old facility, no, they don't do that at laboratories. They wear full respirator outfits. Their whole bodies are covered. And they do this because contamination can happen. Also, if you breed out your own spores, which your Koji can spore, that's part of its life cycle. If you save those spores and then grow another generation, you, me, any of us here that don't have a full laboratory have no way to check. Because Koji, Aspergillus oryzae, evolved from, oh my gosh, I'm blanking right now. Aspergillus flavus. Aspergillus flavus produces the most toxic secondary metabolite, this type of mushroom toxic, on the planet. It is very, very deadly. And there's really only a very, very small genetic difference between oryzae and these toxic producing species that can kill you. And you have no way to track that at home. So this is why we don't grow our own spores. Some people will argue that it is safe to do it for 2, maybe 3 generations before these mutations could possibly show up, but I don't recommend doing it at all. Spores, for the amount that you're paying for spores and the amount of Koji you can grow, it's pennies on the dollar. They're very affordable. They're very inexpensive. And out of the thousands of Koji spore producers that existed in Japan, there's only 7 left. Businesses that have been around for hundreds of years, and they are set up, they're inspected by the Japanese government. They're very, very strict regulations. So now, as far as, Joy's asking about Bacillus cereus contaminating this rice. So Koji gains a foothold before Bacillus cereus does typically. There's several things that happen. Koji spore producers mix in ash with their spores when they're growing. That slight change in alkalinity jumpstart over something like Bacillus cereus. There's very few to no reported cases of intentional inoculation of Koji being thwarted by another microorganism unless knowing or direct contamination has taken place, meaning someone didn't wash their hands properly. They used a dirty tray to mix it in. They didn't take basic food safety into consideration. So Bacillus cereus contamination is very, very unlikely to happen. And there's very documented when growing Koji properly. And, I don't mean to portray this as a very simple thing, but keep in mind, it's very simple steps. And people have been doing this safely for many, many years without our understanding of microbiology and food safety practices. And these traditions have survived. So nowadays, when you do grow your Koji, as long as you take your basic food safety precautions, you wash your hands, you use clean utensils, you cook your grain properly, and then you mix and hold the mold at the proper temperatures, there is virtually no risk in contamination from Bacillus cereus. Koji will definitely outcompete that. Let's see. I'm just kind of going in. So, and Joy, hopefully to kind of put you at ease a little bit too. Here, every once in a while we send our molds off for inspection and that sort of thing. We've been doing this professionally, and I produce anywhere from up to 125 pounds of this a week. We've never had a contamination issue. Now, we have every once in a while, we get Bacillus subtilis contaminating these sorts of things. And Bacillus subtilis, though, if managed properly, is safe to consume. And that's the mold responsible for making the Japanese food natto, those stringy, mucousy beans. As far as Koji grows, like I said, if you take your basic safety precautions, food safety precautions, you should have no no issue with these contaminations. And the very important thing too is using a cooked substrate and making sure that you get those spores on right away. So, you know, even with newcomers around attempting this, you know, and this is why I wrote, you know, with my co-author Rich, we wrote a whole book, you know, that kind of details these things and these steps and makes it very easy, you know, for a beginner per se to get involved and start doing this. Because on a basic level, this really is no difficult or more risky than making sauerkraut. Understanding of what's going on here, you should have very, very few issues. The good thing is too, general rules when it comes to fermentation and creating these foods, if it looks good, smells good, and tastes good, 99% of the time it is going to be good. So, you know, some things to keep in mind too, Bacillus cereus is found in small amounts on the Korean mijo. So mijo is the paste, and it is wild inoculated. So they don't intentionally put koji on it. They take rice husks and they wrap this mashed bean paste in it and then hang it in the rafters of their home or put in a warm, breezy spot and allow wild inoculation to happen. And even then, the accumulation of these bacteria that are potentially pathogenic is low to none. So let's see, where are we?
I wanted to make sure first timers didn't think they could just culture koji, you know, like you were saying, like backslopping or any of that stuff.
Right, exactly. And that's why, you know, we don't cultivate our own spores. We don't propagate it out. Every time we use spores that are from a verified producer, and we just follow the basic steps to making sure that we cook the grain properly, that we have a clean environment, and that we go ahead and make it. So, and you know, if you follow those things, you can't, nothing's ever 100% guaranteed in this life, but you shouldn't have any issues. So, and that's what's wonderful about it. So I see we're getting a little tight on time, so I wanted to show some other examples of some of these foods made with koji.
Yeah, we are fine with you talking as much as you. I'm fine with you talking for the rest of the night, but we are fine with you talking more. And what we could do is maybe take a little short break and then have people who want to hang on, just hang on. I want to be cognizant about your time.
Yeah, I'm fine. You know, I think realistically we could go another 30 minutes if everybody wants.
And anybody who doesn't want to do that, we will have this recorded. So you can, you know, if you need to leave now, you can go to our YouTube channel later and watch the last half hour. But if you're up for spending the time, Jeremy, we'd love to have you.
Oh yeah, this is, my daughter's in bed, so we're good. We're good. I'll actually take quick advantage of the bathroom break. So I'll be back in just a sec.
So and then everybody take like a 3-minute break.
That's wonderful. And then we'll look at some of these wonderful things that you can make.
Awesome.
That's great. Yeah. So we'll get back to Koji now, and then.
Yeah. So.
How many people are left?
So Cordelia's like a bear.
Being an omnivore?
Yeah, bear. Maybe like awesome.
They eat blueberries and salmon.
Yes, and fish and whatever. Insects. Go Cornelia.
Sam has a joke he wants to tell.
Please do.
She's so tired of it. But I say...
Oh, sorry. No, cut him off. Mute him.
I say, you know, people say, is Cornelia a vegetarian too? And I'll say, no. I don't eat anything whose mother had a face.
And she's so awesomely beautiful.
And all that stuff.
So I think there's a magic in there. So go Cornelia.
Okay. Now we're going to let
Jeremy talk.
We're going to let Jeremy talk. Thanks, Jeffrey.
I like that one, Sam. So I think the first category of kind of foods is these amino sauces. So think like soy sauce. And here's an example. This is from 2019. This is a mushroom sauce. So what we did is, and this is Graphola frondosa. So the cooking liquid, the blanching liquid that we have left over when we can the rice, and this was salted to 12% salt by weight. And we end up with a condiment that is, in terms of its use, it's just like soy sauce, but it's mainly a mushroom-based one. And the enzymes that the Koji produces are breaking apart all these wonderful residual proteins in the Koji rice and in the mushroom cooking. End up with these very flavorful, delicious liquids. Traditional soy sauce preparation, whether it's in China or Japan, on average is about a year-long process. From starting to grow the Koji to taking the Koji inoculated bean and or grain and mixing it with salt water and then letting it sit, because sometimes these enzymes work really fast and other times they work really slow. And factors such as how much salt is in something or what type of protein the base protein is can influence that sort of thing. So these sauces often take about a year to make. But if you look at the ingredients are toasted cracked wheat. So you have wheat, soybeans, salt, and water. And last ingredient is thyme. And if you think about the wheat and the soybeans, the water, on their own, like they don't really have this spectacular depth of flavor, this really, really intense savoriness. You know, the salt, of course, has got its own attributes, but by combining them with the enzymes that the mold produces over time, you get this incredible creation of flavor. And that's what's so fantastic and magical about it. So this is one that that you would love. We call this natural beef flavoring. So same process as making a soy sauce, but we use ground beef in it. And this is salted a bit higher. This is about 16% salt by weight. And to give you a reference for, 16% salt, virtually all commercial soy sauces, as long as they're not low salt soy sauce, which isn't even really low. Commercial soy sauce is around 16% salt. So, these are used as seasonings. You use them instead of salt when you're cooking. So, and this one is made from beef. That's the protein we used here. So this was a mix of beef, Koji mold that was grown on barley, salt, and water. And using the beef base for this too, the proteins break down more rapidly because we've already done some denaturization of them. We've already broken them apart by using this cooked ground beef first. And then we also use some of the beef stock here. So you get this awesome beefy condiment that's just really, really, really fascinating. So these sauces, and really, as long as you're, keep your food safety in mind and you use the right percentage of salt and you're clean and you're mindful when you're making them, go ahead. You want to make a chicken amino sauce? You can. You want to make a chicken of the woods one? You can. You just want to make a classic one with beans? You can do that too. So you have the ability to do all these different things with this. And it's great too, because each of us views the world through our own kind of distinct lens, right? We have things in our environment that we rely on to make different decisions in our lives and decide what we like and what we access to some things and other things. So it's great to be able to, create something based on ingredients that you have access to in your area. And it puts like your own unique stamp on these individual foods. And that's what's so wonderful about them. Because let's say you love a very specific type of soy sauce that comes from a region in China or Korea or Japan, that can only be made in that place using, you know, the environment there and the ingredients there. So for you to create and make things of your own, it's really, really, really fun. So the other is amino paste, and miso is a great example. Doenjang's a great example in the Koreas, Jiang in China, and traditionally these are fermented bean pastes. But once again, any type of protein can work as the base. It doesn't just have to be, you know, beans. So as I said with this one, yes, this one had some beans in it, but this is made from huitlacoche. And this one that I have here, you're gonna have to excuse the crudeness of the name on here, but this made from the sperm sacs of walleye. So we use a lot of walleye here. We're right on Lake Erie, and we save every bit of the fish that we can. And there's also some of their livers and hearts in here. You know, we got a bunch of males in that had very, very big cum sacs, very big sperm sacs. We mix that with some barley koji and some salt, and then we have a fish-based amino paste. And I'm sure some of you are saying to yourselves, well, okay, it's crazy you use fish sperm for that. Yes, I understand that, but what then do you use this for? Well, any recipe that's calling for seafood and would also call for a soy sauce or a miso, you can use this as the seasoning in. And imagine miso black cod is a very kind of famous and well-known preparation for using meat. And let it marinate for, you know, a day or a few hours in your fridge, and then you cook it. Well, imagine using fish to season your fish. It's going to be really, really good when you use an inherent ingredient to really bring out the flavors of what you're cooking. So instead of using a bean-based miso for black miso cod or miso black cod, we can use a fish-based one. And we do. We mix this in as a seasoning in our gefilte fish that we make, which is made from ground carp. We also will mix this in with a little bit of this with some mayonnaise when we do a fish fry, and then you have a fish. So, you know, as creative as you want to get, you can get with these sorts of things. So kind of this last class of things that you would, you know, make with Koji is these alcohols. And virtually any type of booze that comes from virtually anywhere in Asia is rice-based for the most part. That's the majority of them. And you can't turn rice into alcohol unless you use Koji and its associated in the rice or the barley or whatever the substrate is into the simple sugars that yeast can then feed on and convert into alcohol. So we make many different types of alcohol here. We don't make the alcohols to make alcohol. We actually make them to make vinegar. So here is a rice vinegar, and you can see there's a nice hunk of mother floating in there. This is the last of a batch that I made in May of 2019. So this is just about to be 2 years old. And originally when this started, it was and you can see over time, any residual protein that was left in here and any residual enzymes that were left in here from the Koji have started to color it and darken it. And it's oxidized in a very good way. And it's gotten much darker. So you can turn your sake, you know, into rice wine vinegar or rice vinegar. Right now I have about 20 gallons of an alcohol made from sweet potatoes. So I grew the black koji mold on sweet potatoes, and I mixed it, made this amazaki, this base that Cornelia was showing before. And the amazaki is a mixture of cooked grain or starch, like cooked rice, koji inoculated rice, and water, and added yeast to it. And we get alcohol. And then eventually we convert that and we make this beautiful black vinegar. And it's really fun making a vinegar with the black mold too, because you get two different types of acidity. You get the citric acid that the koji produced, and the koji itself tastes very sweet because it's broken all these starches down. And then with the citric acid, it tastes very sour too. So you get that sourness, and then you get the acetic acid that that accumulates during the conversion of alcohol into vinegar. So you know, we can always go around and play with all these different things, and really the customization is you know, it's limitless. Literally whatever you can dream up and you can do it safely, you can make. You know, there's another realm that a lot of us have started exploring in the past few years, and it's outside of these kind of three main groups of food. And one of them is working with dairy. Believe it or not, this is ricotta. It's hard. So this is a mixture of barley koji with ricotta and salt in the same ratios that you would mix them together to make miso. But instead of using beans, we're using cheese. And who's familiar with Parmesan? Right? It's called the king or the queen of cheeses. It's savory, it's delicious, it's nutty, it has all this incredible complexity to it. To get to that level, Parmesan on average is aged for well, a lot of what we get here in the US market is just 12 months, but on average it's 24 months to really get Parmesan to be what people consider good Parmesan. We can replicate similar flavors because of the enhanced enzyme activity in koji using ricotta, and this is less than 2 months old. Actually, we started using this. This is dated the 10th of February. So, you know, it was a month and a half old when we started using it. And most people think we're putting Parmesan in their food when we feed this to them. I also make something, I don't have any of it right now. I'm getting ready to make more tomorrow, that we call black cheese. And the recipe for that is in Koji Alchemy, where we mix the black koji rice with cream cheese and salt, and let that kind of autolyze and just barely ferment. And we end up with something that is reminiscent of kind of like Roquefort, but with mushrooms. So like blue cheese with mushrooms. And it's wonderful. We use it on our roast beef sandwiches when we make it. And people are constantly asking us to buy it like in containers. So there's all sorts of fun things you can do with dairy. And in fact, I work with a cheesemaker, dairy farmer, husband and wife, just about 40 minutes south of me. And her line of cheeses, she's been using koji in lately. And she's been making some absolutely incredible things. And she does everything from steeping the koji inoculated rice in the milk as she's cooking it to make the curd, to actually washing some of her cheeses in the amazaki, which is this porridge before it's alcoholic, before it turns to sake. And she's also including koji in her inoculation on some of her soft bloom rind cheeses. Imagine brie, but with koji instead of the other molds that they use for them. So some wonderful things are happening in cheese making. The other end is charcuterie, and give me a sec to go grab this. So Koji's enzymes are so powerful that just a little bit goes a long way for flavor. And a number of years ago, I started growing Koji on meat instead of other molds used in charcuterie making. And this divulged into two different techniques. One where we actually grow Koji on fresh meat that has not been cured with salt and everything to make charcuterie, like these preserved meats like prosciutto and salami. And when we do that in a very controlled way, which is definitely detailed very intensively in Koji Alchemy, we end up in 36 hours creating a flavor profile in fresh meat, which is akin to that of 30 or 45-day aged dry aged meat. So imagine you go to a steakhouse and you get a 30-day dry aged steak. We can create that in 36 hours. The other end of that is using Koji as a charcuterie mold. And you can see what's left of the mold that's been grown on the outside of this piece of beef sirloin. And this goes through a curing process and everything to salt the meat and to draw moisture out and all these things. And then we grow Koji on the outside. And then when we go to hang the meat to let it dry, this very important step in making charcuterie, the Koji mold does a number of things. Its enzymes are creating more flavor, inherent flavor out of like the cut of meat. So it's making beef charcuterie taste more like beef and pork charcuterie taste more like pork. The mold is still alive when we hang it, and it still lives for a little bit. So it's actually drawing moisture at a rapid rate out of the meat. And then aside from the flavor creation, the enzymatic activity is also helping to tenderize the meat, because on a microscopic level, it's breaking apart the fibers, the proteins, the muscle fibers that make the meat tough. And we do everything from beef. Here's more beef. This is a chuck eye roll, and look at that beautiful marbling there. Sorry, Sam, and all the other vegetarians / vegans. Here's some beef fat that we cure with it to make a beef version of lardo, cured pork fat. This is lamb cuditello. This is a cut off the back leg. So we can use this in rapidly aging meat and also making charcuterie. And, you know, after I developed this technique for charcuterie, I started thinking to myself, well, vegetables are mainly starch, and they're mainly comprised of the starches that Koji love. So we started messing around, and we started treating vegetables and running them through the same processes that we use to make meat charcuterie. So we started taking carrots and beets, and we would par cook them. Like the beets we boil and then we smoke. The carrots we just hot smoke. And then we cure them with salt and spices in the same safe ratios that we do for the meat charcuterie. And then we grow the mold on them, and then we let them dry out, and we get vegan charcuterie made from vegetables. So this one's a beet, and a little bit of the mold came off here. This one's a carrot, but we do zucchini and pumpkin. And actually, this is some maitake, some of our canned maitake that I salted with the charcuterie ratios, which for this, I'm doing 2.75% salt on this. In a couple days, I'll squeeze all the water out. I'll coat this in cornstarch and Koji spores, and I will be able to grow this into like a log type tempeh-like loaf that we can kind of make like a mushroom pate out of. That's completely vegan. So, you know, there's some really exciting things. And you know, for this, the same way you treat prosciutto, right? You slice it really thin, you have some dried fruit and some cheese and some crackers out. You know, in this case, because it's vegan, you have some nice cashew cheese, some good crackers, a little dried fruit, and you slice this very thinly, and it eats like charcuterie. And they happen to eat very meat-like. And part of it is because of the processes that we use, like the smoking and some of the spices sometimes we use, like smoked paprika and cumin and that sort of thing. But the other part is these vegetables have small amounts of proteins in them. And the Koji mold is using its enzymes to create umami flavor out of the vegetables. So we're able to create a vegetable that eats and tastes like these different cured meats. And they still retain their identity as a carrot. You know, you cut it and you look at it, it's a carrot and it has carrot flavor to it. But the second you swallow that piece of carrot, you would have sworn you just ate a piece of prosciutto. And that's what's so fascinating about some of these new techniques that are coming online.